Hello, and welcome to Minding the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. I'm your host, Jeff Zeringue. In Minding the Forest, we'll talk about sustainable forestry, how important forests are to Louisiana and its economy, as well as issues in the forest products industry and how forests benefit everyone. We have with us Paul Stone. Paul is the Conservation Forester for Crobsy Resources Management, a subsidiary of Crobsy Land and Resources. Paul is also the Endangered Species Chairman for the Louisiana Forestry Association, which you've been doing for quite some time as well, haven't you?
A few years now, yeah.
Let's get an overall look for what endangered species means. How is it regulated? Endangered Species Act is common, I think, knowledge for many forest land owners. But let's talk a little bit about that and that history.
Well, the Endangered Species Act itself was some time in coming. There have been administrations, government programs who were very interested in environmental issues, things like the Clean Water Act and other acts that predated the Endangered Species Act that came to be involved or evolved into the laws that we have today. But if you go back to presidents like Teddy Roosevelt, they kind of viewed Teddy Roosevelt as our first environmental president. He was the first to set aside national parks, national forests, and he was very much involved in wildlife management. I think Teddy Roosevelt was probably the father of our environmental presidents that followed. After he came along and identified areas that he felt should be turned into national parks, there was a big disagreement as to who should be in charge of natural resources in the United States. Should it be the Department of the Interior, where we have the Park Service and environmental agencies like Fish and Wildlife Service, and you have then the alternative, which was the Department of Agriculture, which is where the national forests fall under. And so for 100 and some years, there's been a tug of war between agencies as to who should have control of national forests and parks, and the Bureau of Land Management lands out west. They have millions of acres of forest in different landscapes that people aren't even aware are out there. And so it's been a long time coming that the forests and wildlife at a national level would fall under one agency or the other or both, apart from the states, because each state has its own wildlife management as well. And so, like the Endangered Species Act, if you violate part of the Endangered Species Act, you generally are violating a state law at the same time. If you violate a state law regarding an endangered species, you're also violating a federal portion of the Endangered Species Act. So you have a dual violation there. You may be prosecuted at the state or federal level or both.
Would they do those things separately, or would they do those things as the state would take its own case and the feds would take its own case?
Generally, you're prosecuted separately, and so you could be duly prosecuted. They could charge you both, but a state violation would generally be a state court, and then the federal violation would be done in a federal court.
What principally are we looking at now? The black bear has been one that's been listed on the threatened list, and that seems to be doing really well. Recently, we had a conversation with NRCS representative who talked about the gopher tortoise over in the southeastern part of the state. The pine snake in recent couple of years has been listed, and those things have been talked about. And, of course, the red cockaded woodpecker has been on the list for quite some time. So those are the things that I think are more common, but what else is out there that we need to be aware of?
Well, there's a couple ways for an animal or a plant to get off of the endangered species list. They're basically either recovered, so our efforts have been successful and the population has increased, or they become extinct. And I think currently there's a proposal to take 23 species off of the list because they're considered to be extinct now, such as the ivory-billed woodpecker. Mm-hmm. They don't believe there's any left. They'd been listed basically as extirpated, just gone from here, but since we haven't been able to find any anywhere, they're considering taking them off of the list due to extinction. There's not a fixed number of years, but if they have looked intensively for 5 to 10 years and they just have absolutely no recording of it, no sighting of it, no verifiable pictures of it, then they'll start looking at it for removal by an extinction classification. So the next species that we're going to be discussing coming up would be an uplisting of the northern long-eared bat. And long-eared bat basically is on the list not because of man or its habitat destruction. It's more of a matter that there's a disease that's wiping them out, the white nose disease that's getting in its hibernacula, which is the areas where they nest and stay over winter, and spreading within the population. And so some estimates are that it's already wiped out 90% of the bats. Even though it has a very extensive range, the areas that they like to winter in are such that it's easy to spread that disease, and very difficult to create habitat that's not suitable for that infection to be spread through.
They are in Louisiana, correct?
Correct. They're about mid-state and north is listed as potential habitat for the northern long-eared bat. But the problem is we don't have a lot of caves and a lot of things, a lot of habitat that they prefer. They'll use bridges and culverts. In nature, they'll use hollow trees and forks and trees such as shagbark hickory, which historically Louisiana had a lot of shagbark, and that would provide a really nice habitat. They could get under the large pieces of bark and use that habitat. There's not as many shagbark hickories left in the state. And hollow trees, any kind of damage, they'll actually get into a fork of a tree if there's nothing else for them to get into.
Does it make a difference? Because generally up north there is hibernation, whereas it's more of a torpor in the south where it doesn't get cold long enough for the long hibernation such as in the north. Does that make a difference in its survival down here?
Well, I think it's more that there are other closely related species to the northern bat. I believe there's a western subspecies and perhaps a southern one as well that occupies our habitat more than the northern one. And so they go through western Canada, I think almost to Alaska, and through forested habitats. So that particular species is going to be listed for northern Louisiana, but I don't believe southern Louisiana, it will affect us too much.
When you say it's please say that term again.
The classification will be raised up from threatened to endangered, an uplisting.
Uplisting, okay.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard for folks to understand, but there is a significant difference in those two. Even though once they hit the list, they have the protections of the Endangered Species Act, and violating it basically has some of the same penalties, or most of the same penalties. There are tools under the law which allow us to do more if it's just threatened. We have a 4D rule, and when that's developed, landowners, forest managers will have the opportunity to do more management without having to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service every time. And if the activity is considered beneficial in the long run for the species, for instance, red-cockaded woodpeckers, we don't have to consult to do a prescribed burn. That was over the years because the 4D rule allowed that, and then under the recovery plan, it said that's something that's beneficial to the bird, so you don't have to call us every time you're going to burn in their habitat. The potential to do detrimental things to the bird are likely to be less than the benefit provided by the burn. So you might burn up a tree that was a colony tree, a tree that a bird nested in, but the habitat's going to be improved to the point where it's still going to benefit more.
It seems to occur more often that the standard practices that folks do to manage their forests have more benefit than anything else. The 4D rule, as you were talking about for red-cockaded woodpeckers, similar practices that were talked about when the Louisiana pine snake became on the endangered species list. So fire, replanting, things of that nature, if I recall correctly, were beneficial to the pocket gopher, which is main food of the pine snake. Not that we see that very much everywhere, do we?
Forest management is something that, for the most part, benefits wildlife. And when I'm teaching our master logger classes, I tell our loggers and our foresters, every decision we make as forest land managers is a benefit to some wildlife, but it's at the expense of other wildlife. For instance, for years, they taught us that we should make our clear cuts irregularly shaped and create as much edge effect as possible. Well, that benefits certain species like deer. Game species prefer that edge habitat. But it's actually detrimental to songbirds and to some wildlife that prefer a large open without a lot of edge where predators are going to prey on them. We also leave a lot of wildlife snags in our clear cuts. We know there's a lot of benefit to salamanders, to herpetiles, they call them. A lot of creatures will use those snags. They're also a perch for a hawk to sit there and watch for songbirds and the other small wildlife that use those openings as well. So it's a trade-off in everything you do, and so the best thing you can do is to plan and know which benefits your wildlife with a particular management strategy, and which ones are going to be detrimental.
In the course of animals seeking food, just about any wildlife can be at risk. Songbirds, rabbits, squirrels, things of that nature. Is it a trade-off?
Well, it's kind of difficult for us as managers. We spend a lot of time, if you have endangered species such as the red-cockaded woodpecker in your forest, you put a lot of effort into providing enough nesting habitat and foraging habitat where the forest is open like they prefer, and you have herbaceous species and grass species that create the insects that they forage on the trees. But if you, after you've watched these birds and actually perhaps even held them and banded them and spent a lot of time prescribed burning for them, and then to have a hawk or an owl eat them, it's kind of hard not to kind of feel a little bit that he's taken a lot of your work away.
That's understandable. Yeah.
So in some instances, it's kind of hard to accept nature as it is, but as a biologist, they teach that's nature, and you're going to lose some to predation.
What is the process to create the 4D rules? And I guess first explain what the 4D rules are that deals with practices that are beneficial to the species.
The activities that are normal activities for forest management, but in our instance, it could be agriculture, it could be another practice, but from our perspective, it's forest management. Activities that will also benefit, like you mentioned, for the Louisiana pine snake, in keeping it burned for the herbaceous plant species that the pocket gopher prefer to eat. And so first thing that has to be done is you have to identify which activities may possibly benefit. You have to identify what are the habitat needs of the species and then what activities will benefit that particular niche of the species, such as the herbaceous. Um, the mid-story competition control for red cockaded woodpeckers. They don't like mid-story competition because snakes are a main predator. They'll climb up a small hardwood tree next to a nesting tree and then crawl over and go into the hole, and then they'll predate the eggs or the young or even the parents. And we've had that happen numerous times where a snake can get in there. They can climb a pine tree. I've watched them climb pine trees, and you would think they were on flat ground how quickly they can climb a pine tree.
Wow, that's amazing.
And the woodpeckers, they peck the tree to create the sap on there because the sap will get under the scales of the snake's belly and burn the snake, and they'll drop off. So that's one of their defenses.
Okay.
So, but you have to encourage the trees to have a healthy sap flow and discourage the hardwood competition, and kind of a full meal deal. You have to create an entire package of habitat management that benefits the bird, but it's at the expense of the snake. We've decided that we don't want the snake, but we do want the bird in this habitat that we're expending all this energy on.
When you identify those practices, and I keep coming back to Louisiana pine snake, I guess it was my first experience in learning about this. There was a big discussion on what practices were beneficial, and then in those practices, it came up with, okay, if we're going to harvest, then we're going to replant. And then there's a big discussion, well, how deep do you replant? Do you mechanical replant? Do you hand replant? And all of that involves risks. So how are those rules discussed or debated so that it comes to a final ruling by the federal government that, yes, you can hand plant, but we discourage mechanical planting? How does that work?
A deep mechanical planting would be something that they would discourage because the mechanical activity is going to collapse the tunnels of the pocket gopher. So really can't find a part of mechanical planting if you were using heavy equipment. You really can't point to a part of that and say that benefits the snake and the gopher beyond the fact that you're keeping it forested. You're not going to take that land and convert it to other uses as long as it's in forest. Therefore, the trade-off is, yes, you might do some disturbance by planting, but in the long run, that tract is going to stay suitable habitat much longer if it's a forest than if it's non-forested. The pine snake prefers that herbaceous habitat for the pocket gopher that's a result of prescribed burning. Okay, well, if we're going to prescribe burn, we're going to want fire lanes to keep our fires where they belong and where we intend for them to stay. Well, we're going to have to disturb it. We're either going to use a bulldozer or we're going to use disking. We're going to create a fire lane to stop our fires, even though we know that disc or that bulldozer may collapse some tunnels, and there is the chance that you could have a take of a species by creating the fire break to improve the habitat over the remainder of the tract. We just have to look at the trade-off. The trade-off is, yes, we're going to disturb probably too much the fire lane, but the remainder of the acreage is going to benefit and end up with more habitat suitable for the snake than if we didn't burn.
And those are just normal management practices in caring for the forest.
Prescribed burning is one we've used historically. It's used for debris management when we're using it as a site preparation before planting. But because our forests have been adapted to fire for thousands of years, it's a matter of we continue to burn just to continue the species that benefit from burning as well. So they are normal practices. Planting is something you can hand plant and reduce the chances of perhaps disturbance of the tunnels of the pocket gopher, and lessen the chance. And that's probably viewed as a more beneficial activity to mechanical planting.
We've talked a little bit about few of the species that are endangered. Do you know how many species are listed on the endangered species list in Louisiana?
I don't know on how many are listed for our state. There's about 1,260, I believe, on the entire list. I believe that's including plants and insects, and there are a few that are listed multiple times as well. So it may be 1,230 or something that are actual species, but you may have disjunct populations that are both listed on the Endangered Species Act, like the gopher tortoise. For many years, they were not treated the same east of the Mississippi as they were west of the Mississippi, and or from Alabama east and then east to the Mississippi or west to the Mississippi. And so those different populations may be listed separately and have different guidelines for managing. They may be listed as threatened in one region and may be endangered in another. And where it's endangered, you don't have the opportunity for a 4D rule. It kicks that opportunity out, and therefore when you want to do an activity, you have to consult with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to make sure that you're not going to violate the Endangered Species Act by doing something that could potentially take.
So with the discussion of the long-eared bat with that particular species, because the discussions are now to uplist it from threatened to endangered, how would that change management in areas of Louisiana where that particular bat species is found?
It could mean that we lose some opportunities for habitat management without consultation. We're a little bit concerned about that. What does it mean when the bat is in human habitation or around human buildings? Because you're not supposed to handle them without basically a permit to handle them, and technically you have to apply for a permit to harass the endangered species is technically how they view it. There's not a lot we'll be able to do. In some cases, you just have to allow them to take over the habitat and they become dominant. And by doing that, it may inevitably lead to habitat that's no longer suitable. It may brush up to the point where there's too many predators, and so by not managing and allowing them to take over the habitat, you may actually be doing what's worst for the species in the long run. So we have a lot of questions about how that's going to affect our management in Louisiana. It could mean minor changes to our management where we leave more snags in our clear cuts or defective trees, deformed trees, those sort of places that a bat would love to live. Normally we'll do some of that now, but we may have to leave more per acre as a requirement, and we may have to protect them from later site preparation. We may have to put a fire line around them when we do a burn, where previously they might get burned up. We want to protect those snags from burning as well.
So that's going to change management practices in Louisiana, should it be listed. Will it hinder in any way harvests?
We're not sure at this point. We're not sure how it will affect our harvest. It's really only listed at this time as having been located in the northern third of the state, is listed as northern long-eared bat habitat. In Vernon Parish, Beauregard Parish, where we are today, it's not listed as using these parishes. Historically, we're in an area that's not prone to having caves or geological formations that they are used to having. So historically, they probably weren't here a whole lot. They may travel in here and they may use some of our trees during part of the year, but they don't have places, and it's warm and they don't hibernate here, and so it just isn't going to affect us in the lower 2/3 of the state. But the northern third of the state, it could have some impacts on our management as to what we're required to do. A lot of times you may have to just survey and see if you can find a species, if it's out there, that you have to modify your management for. If you don't have red cockaded woodpeckers, that kind of frees you up in your management. The problem is there's a lot of regulatory questions that the public are confused by because the laws have evolved over the years, get more complicated. They rarely simplified the laws. And so it scares them to the point where they may modify their management just to avoid the species. For instance, Louisiana, the red cockaded woodpecker uses timber pretty much 30 years and older for foraging. 60 years and older is what's considered suitable habitat for nesting. Well, so landowners will set a management goal of cutting their timber at 29 so they don't have to ever worry about violating the Endangered Species Act because of that bird coming on and foraging on their property.
For companies that manage several thousand acres, tens or hundreds even, they are conscious enough to know what's on the property, if there are any endangered species that they have to be aware of, and the practices that will take care of that. Most of the forested area in Louisiana is owned by private landowners, and many of them are smaller landowners. They may or may not know what's on their property. So what's the advice you would give them?
Well, we have a really good program in the state of Louisiana as far as working with our wildlife and our landowners. The Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries, as an agency, I think in Louisiana does a better job than many states. And you can contact Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. You can first go onto their website and find out what are the potential species that are endangered or threatened or just rare that may be encountered in the parish that your property is in. So you can go to the Natural Heritage Program portion of the Louisiana Department of Wildlife and Fisheries website and find a parish listing, and it may tell you, well, there's the potential for a red cockaded woodpecker, it could be Louisiana pine snake, it could be the black bear, number of species and plants. And so then if you look at that and you say, well, okay, so there is the potential for red cockaded woodpecker and Louisiana pine snake. My land is all in a creek bottom. I pretty much don't have to worry about the pine snake or the red cockaded woodpecker. So immediately you're pretty sure that you won't have to modify your management, you won't have to survey, you're good to go. And a consulting forester is going to do that if you contact a consulting forester about helping you to set up management like timber harvesting. So he's going to be sure to know that if you had upland pine that was old, it had fire as a historical regime, he's going to know, well, there is the possibility. I may have to survey for the woodpecker. I may have to grid it out and look and see if there are any trees being used. But Wildlife and Fisheries has also a natural heritage listing, and that will tell you a lot of occurrences. Actually, you can find out what is the closest distance to a known rare species or endangered species from my property, and they can help you to determine that.
What are some of the things we haven't yet talked about concerning endangered species that should be at least on the minds of folks who have forested land, people who might be considering management programs, either through a consulting forester or reaching out to LSU Ag Center or Louisiana Department of Ag and Forestry? What are some of those things that we haven't yet talked about?
Well, there's a number of programs available for a landowner to get some assistance if he's really interested in managing his habitat. And I tell young people going into college, it's really a preferred program to enter for wildlife management. But I tell them, if you really want to help wildlife, you manage habitat. And a forester is going to end up modifying habitat, managing habitat far more than a wildlife biologist. You may not handle the individual bird or the individual animals as much, but you're going to help wildlife and plants a lot more if you are actually working with their habitat. The main thing for folks to remember is they shouldn't be afraid of the Endangered Species Act. It's supposed to be out there to help the species. It's not supposed to hinder us. Sometimes administrations use it more as a bludgeon to stop things. There are groups who actually use Endangered Species Act to beat foresters and logging over the head and use it as a blunt instrument to stop logging. But in the long run, they rarely can stop it long term because we've worked through the science. We know what's best for the species. There's also programs that will help to cost share the management. And so if you had a cluster of red-cockaded woodpeckers on your property, you can get cost share funding through the federal government or through the state government to help you to modify the habitat and improve that habitat. And in the long run, by increasing the numbers, you're eventually going to get that bird downlisted from endangered to threatened, which again creates opportunity for a 4D rule, or you may get it downlisted completely where it's no longer protected and eventually may become a game species such as the black bear.
Is there consideration now for the black bear to have a hunting season for that?
There's a big discussion over that. There's getting to be a large number of bears. They're sighted. I get calls from people almost weekly, some of our hunting clubs saying, hey, I've got a bear on my game camera. And did you know they were there? And of course, yes, we know they're out there and they're doing a pretty good job of increasing their population. And especially the more we have human and bear encounters, we're going to end up with some opportunities. They're going to either have to thin populations or do something to control the populations because we've done a good job with the bears. It's the same way with gray wolves in a lot of habitats. You know, people don't like the idea of hunting the wolf, and so they've blocked wolf control, population control through hunting, but they're also having a lot of predation on cows and sheep, and deer populations are being affected pretty severely. So hunting is just another tool in our toolbox for modifying and taking populations that are maybe a little too large and reducing them before a disease or some other negative, uncontrollable factor does it for us.
So the Louisiana black bear sounds like a success story.
It is. It's very much a success story. And we can tell that it's actually crossed over. I get reports over in East Texas that our bears have swum the river, gone across the Sabine, and now they're over there and repopulating in East Texas as well. And that's where Teddy Roosevelt encountered the first big thicket bear 100-some years ago. They wanted Teddy to shoot one. He said that was not sporting. They had one tied up. Wanted him to shoot a tied up bear, and he said, that's not sporting. I would never do that. Turn him loose. And he turned the bear loose, and that was the first. They started calling him the teddy bear. That's where the teddy bear came from, is that bear in East Texas.
Paul Stone, the conservation forester for Crobsy Resource Management. Thanks for joining us today. We appreciate that.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to Minding the Forest, a podcast of the Louisiana Forestry Association. If you'd like to learn more about sustainable forestry, the LFA and its programs, and how you can be part of an organization that supports landowners, loggers, and wood manufacturers in the state, go to laforestry.com. And remember, at the Louisiana Forestry Association, we're minding the forest for you.